Games Workshop, Warhammer 40,000, Vigilus Defiant, Part 2. The counterattacks begin. Many Imperial commanders of Vigilus saw the Orc junk forts blighted the horizon as a call to arms. They mustered their mechanical regiments and artillery, sending them out into the wastes with the express intention of hammering the Orcs into the sand before they could consolidate their positions. After the Orcs made planetfall, Astra Militarum armoured columns rolled out of city gates across the planet to the blare of fanfare klaxons and the cheers of the citizenry. Into the wastes they went, so numerous that the dust kicked up by their passage could be seen from low orbit. Valkyries and Vendetta gunships hurtled overhead, their holds packed with veteran soldiers and elite Militarum Tempestus scions, eager to take the fight to the foe. Some of the armoured convoys sent on missions of reconnoitre or resupply made it to their destinations with minimal damage. The Padrillas Ponte fuel column allowed Storval to reinforce Fort Caffinus with vital war material mere hours before it was assaulted by Orc commandos. The Valkyrie squadron, known as the Winged Grail, carried several demolition squads through a network of Orc flakadaka wagons, braving intense fire to land near the can factory of Runthive, and before dawn that site was reduced to smoking scrap. The Aquario column reached Dontorio Hivespool virtually intact, its water tankers holed by Orc bullets but plugged up once more with the fingers of the many conscripts sent to guard it, until the steel of each cylinder could hardly be seen for human bodies. A great many of their fellow convoys, however, did not return. Already, the Orc speedsters were scouring the wastes, driving pell-mell in search of things to kill. Here and there, an amble colony or sandrat nest was riddled with bullets for target practice, but the nascent war was yet to get truly stuck in. Red eyes scanned the horizon for signs of life, barked commands directed outriders even further, and pointed ears pricked up for the telltale crump and boom of distant battle. At the sight of the blocky silhouettes of Chimeras and Lehman Russ battle tanks on the horizon, a great whooping shout went up from each speed mob, and the Orcs closed in from all sides. The resultant desert warfare was typified by the shriek of heavy lasfire, the ping of bullets ricocheting from reinforced armour, and the thunder of detonating battle cannon shells. Huge losses mounted on both sides. At first, the convoys of the Imperial Guard reaped a heavy toll, blasting dozens of Orc contraptions into scrap with each passing minute, for in a long-range engagement, their artillery and ordnance gave them a definite edge over the ramshackle vehicles of the Orcs. But the Imperial forces could not kill them all. In announcing their presence in so spectacular a fashion, they had sealed their fate. Attracted by the signs of battle from miles away, the Orc speed freaks swarmed ever thicker. At first, a few isolated warbikers and buggies got through the cordon of fire with cunning and reckless abandon, only to be cut down by volleys of lasfire and sheets of flame. But every time a squadron was occupied in killing one target, another got closer, and at breakneck pace. Before too long, the Orcs had reached close quarters, where their heedless fury could truly make its mark, and once that tipping point had been reached, there was no coming back. The Battle of Morning Gorge. On the southern outskirts of Megaborealis, the 121st Goliath Armoured Battle Group was destroyed by the actions of a single maniacal Orc. Frackbad Squigbiter intended to watch the speed war race through the miles-deep Morning Gorge from command vantage point. He and his mob scaled the cliff ahead of time, only to see an Astra Militarum blockade move to the end of the canyon, and a Vigilite artillery company take position on the precipice. As the speed war drove headlong into the trap, Squigbiter hurled so many stick bombs at the nearest artillery piece, a Death Strike missile launcher, that the cliff itself gave way, toppling the great warhead into the valley below. The resultant explosion annihilated the blockade and much of the speed warband, before the rest bullied its way through the flames, completing the encirclement of nearby Stormval and cutting off a vital supply route for the Imperium. A sickness in Dontoria. Dontoria Highspool was the largest of all the planet Vigilus's inhabited regions. It was noted for one thing above all else, its overpopulation. As a result, When one of mankind's darkest and most ancient enemies decided to make Dontoria its playground, the consequences were devastating. The bustle and mayhem of Dontoria's streets was bewildering, even before the coming of the Kikarix Maledictum. The black market barons and czars in control of that high sprawl knew well enough that building tall was a waste of resources. Unlike many of their peers, they were too hidebound, unimaginative, or afraid of bucking the rules to stop building upwards. They had instead opted to spread as wide as possible, even if that meant narrowing the streets to the point that entire regions became one vast hablock. As a result of this land grab, the buildings were packed in close together, every available space capitalized upon, so much so that people had to rub shoulders and share humid air if they wished to proceed above ground. To enter the subterranean levels brought its own risks. Down there, power cuts were common, and those stranded in the darkness did not always come out. Such a rich, teeming source of life attracted predators and other baleful influences, just as shoals of Vexencrill attract the leviathans of the ancient deeps. The Drukhari of Kaelax's Bane had raided the high sprawl more than once, taking a rich haul of slaves back to their base. The cult of the Pauper Princes, seeing in the sprawl a great many converts to be, spread from Megaborealis to infest its lower levels, and began the slow, insidious life cycle of their patriarch all over again. But the false continent's doom was to come from another source entirely. In the year 2.230 post, Dontoria's principal spaceport, Litmus Dock, received reports of an unknown vessel inbound. It was a pattern vessel that even the tech adepts seconded from Megaborealis considered ancient, encrusted with the filth of millennia and some manner of strange culk that made its shape seem as much organic as mechanical. A rain of filth drizzled from its hatchways and airlocks as it came down, its crew ignoring the increasingly insistent calls for its animus codes. When the dock's garrison opened fire upon the vessel with their Icarus autocannon emplacements, some manner of shield repelled the shots. Even las cannons proved unable to pierce the unaccountably strong barrier. The ship docked, by now surrounded by arbitrators and garrison troops. Its hatches clunked open, and stumbling out came a crowd of distended, bloated mutants, the ambulatory corpses known as Gelapox infected. Their assault on the garrison was easily put down by disciplined lasfire, but that which followed was all but impervious. A detachment of Death Guard. Their bulbous and horned silhouettes identified them as the same heretic Astartes that had assaulted Ultramar not long before. A fierce, close-range firefight broke out, but the Death Guard shrugged off all but the most dire injuries. They used the infected as fleshy shields, quickly going to ground via the underway dry docks of Litmus's lower levels. With coordination at an all-time low due to the Noctis Eterna and the myriad other threats upon Vigilus, the hunt for the invaders was not reinforced. No armed force was keen on rooting out entrenched heretic Astartes, but many of the elite guardsmen and those arbitrators with a keen sense of duty braced themselves and went into the depths. Some found nothing, others found painful death. When Tempestor Neod ordered the lower levels firebombed within a 2-mile radius, the Imperial forces considered the matter closed. Neod withdrew the 98th Lamdic Oxen from the operation, and the hunt slowly ground to a halt. Only when a strange plague started to manifest across the district did it become clear that the scions of Nurgle had been diligent indeed. The Galapox infection. Sickness and disease in Dontoria was commonplace, a natural byproduct of having such a high population density. By and large, the high sprawl had been inured to it, even when hundreds of thousands of lives were claimed by affluenza, dry lung, or red smog fever. However, rumours of a strange supernatural plague were emanating from the district around Litmus Dock, a disease that melded flesh with metal to form hideous blends of man, machine, and demonic anatomy. With each day the reports became more prevalent until the entire area was on the verge of panic. Only the rogue trader Deliric Dulanguil, operating out of Litmus's higher spire on her quest to chart the Nachmund Gauntlet, recognized the disease for what it was, the Galapox. It was a sickness contracted on long warp journeys, where the ship's Geller field had glitched long enough for baleful empiric energies to enter the vessel, and it mingled the paranormal maladies of the Plague Father, Nurgle, with the flesh and metal hybridization so common to the ranks of the Imperium, especially those of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Dulanguil theorized that the disease had been deliberately carried to the hive spore by the Death Guard, who then released it amongst the population before going to ground. It spread like wildfire. Already the citizens were up in arms, burning the infected wherever they were encountered, but in doing so, driving the rest into hiding. In the slums and shanty towns of the Pravdas and Grodholev subsprawls, the creatures known as Twisted Lords rose to prominence, each the monarch of his own ever-growing band of mutants and nightmarish hulking terrors. The streets thronged with giant vermin, twisted beyond biological limits into monstrosities. Gutters were thick with sludge grubs, and eye-stinger swarms flitted through the skies in search of fresh prey. The blessings of Father Nurgle were well and truly upon Dontoria, and it would take a Herculean effort to banish them. Using her own ship and high status to travel from Litmus Dock to Saints Haven, Dulanguil requested extensive quarantine measures of the Aquilarian Council, though privately she feared her revelation was already too late. The path to victory. Hyperia Highsprawl, long defended by the Vigilant Guard and the Adeptus Sororitas of our martyred lady, had succeeded in holding the Orcs at bay for over a year by the time the Brazen Claws arrived. Using the vast structures of each building as ready-made keeps and conceding the ground floors to the Orc menace when necessary, the Allied forces used stairwells, alleyways and crypt entrances as choke points to hold back the green tide. Yet their orders from the Aquilarian Council were explicit and oft repeated. They were to defend, to hold their position in case any surprise attack or assassination attempt that might threaten their masters. Because of this, they were robbed of the ability to counterattack, to land a killing blow upon the reeling foe. As it was, even when beaten soundly, the Greenskins regrouped and always came back for more within a matter of days. It was only when the striking red and blue heraldry of the Brazen Claws appeared in the streets that Orcs were trapped, caught between the hammer of the Space Marines' armoured assault on the outskirts and the anvil of the Imperial troops in the city proper. From that point on, the south of Hyperia Highsprawl remained under Imperial control. The Summon of Angels of Death. With the Noctis Eterna stealing away the guiding light of the Astronomicon, most Space Marine forces had arrived piecemeal or not at all. Those that made planetfall hit home with punitive force. The elements of the Adeptus Astartes that reached Vigilus first had already been en route from the Stygius system when the Great Rift appeared. They had therefore made it to the system with but a single warp transition. This had been fraught and violent, but in comparison to the suffering of the other Space Marine chapters that headed for Vigilus, it was a relatively short ordeal to endure. Like swimming across a fast river full of sharp rocks, the true odyssey was undertaken by those chapters that would come later. The first Space Marines to make landfall were far from numerous, small but potent strike forces that were less than chapter strength, even when counted as one single military unit. They were engaged in battle within seconds of setting foot upon the planet, for it is in the nature of Space Marines to attack from above with speed and surety. In Hyperia, the Brazen Claws set about slaughtering the Orc menace in as efficient and merciless a fashion as possible, hoping to stem the tide of greenskins that encroached upon the richest of the false continents and its seat of governance. The Iron Hands took the fight to Mega Borealis, recognizing the macro structures of their Adeptus Mechanicus allies. The Space Wolves concentrated their attacks upon Otek Highsprawl, for they had received word of a Xenos infestation here that would test their hunting skills. The strike forces hit hard, but so disparate were their attacks that they failed to make any global impact. Indeed, the Space Wolves hardly communicated at all with Cardon Stronos of the Iron Hands, and did not coordinate their attacks in any real way. After briefly communicating their intent to the Planetary Governors' Council, a process that in itself proved frustrating and counterintuitive, none of the Space Marine chapters sent representatives to the War Councils of Saints Haven. They were made to fight and to kill, and spending hours in debate with bureaucrats was not their way. Instead, They focused their efforts on communicating with their chapter brothers, no matter how distant they might be. As they made their way from the Vigilus system's Mandeville Point to orbit the planet itself, the ships of the Space Wolves, Iron Hands and Brazen Claws had passed several worlds that appeared to be under heavy chaos attack. The librarians of the respective strike forces sent psychic missives as best they could to their chapter masters, hoping more reinforcements would be sent in time. No mental communion could be attempted without risking dire consequences now that the Great Rift split the Imperium, rendering even the most stable astropathic duct volatile. Even a planet-to-planet communique could cause a sender's mind to be rent apart. Nonetheless, all knew that the situation was dire, and the notion of duty was so thoroughly ingrained in the Adeptus Astartes that not one librarian shirked from the task of communicating with their chapter to call for reinforcements. From the relative sanctity of the Terran side of the rift, word sped of Vigilus's plight and newfound importance, and fleets were mustered from a dozen chapter homeworlds to head out for the mouth of the Nakmun Gauntlet. In the dead of night, whilst en route to Valantis 9, Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines had been visited by a vision of his old friend Tigurius. He was glad to see that ghostly apparition at first, for he knew that this was not simply some insubstantial dream. The chief librarian was reaching out to him in his astral form, and evidently he had a message of great import to convey. Tigurius pressed his spectral index fingers across Calgar's temples. In that moment, the terrible knowledge gleaned by the chief librarian was imparted, a collage of mental images and powerful symbolism that seared itself into Calgar's mind. That link might have driven a lesser man to madness, but despite the recent ordeal of his surgical enhancement to Primaris status, Calgar withstood the mental blitz, passing and compartmentalizing the flood of images almost as fast as they entered his mind. The High Council of Macragge had need of him as their sword and shield in the Imperium Nihilus. The Primarch himself had ordered that Vigilus could not be allowed to fall. Then the image of Tigurius faded, tears of blood streaking his cheeks, and was gone. But the deed was done, and soon a new host of angels took flight. Calgar's journey. Though the Ultramarines had a long and harrowing journey to reach Vigilus, Lord Calgar arrived to lead a full 4 companies into battle. He aimed to command the fight on every level, from the calculations of the strategic long game to the brutal onslaught of adrenaline-pounding melee. After recovering from Tigurius' strange visitation, Marneus Calgar hastened to gather a relief force of every Adeptus Astartes asset he could requisition, convince, or command to his side. Though all forces were already engaged in the active protection of the Imperium and destruction of its foes, Calgar's sharp analytic mind allowed him to pair off resources from stable fronts wherever possible, repurpose war fleets that had been stranded or misplaced, and enlist several new Primaris chapters from the Indomitus Crusade. He had ordered his captains and fellow chapter masters to brief their navigators as to what was at stake and made haste for the Vigilus system. To make the necessary warp jumps in time to reach the planet before it fell would have been next to impossible were it not for the astropathic link Tigurius had forged with Lord Calgar. Surrounded by his finest librarian disciples in the depths of the fortress of Hera, the chief librarian mentally guided the Ultramarines' fleet, and by extension their allies, through the madness of the Imperium Nihilus. Doing so had a terrible cost. Several epistolaries died clawing out their own eyes, slowly consumed from the inside by the empiric ritual, just as the psychers that fueled the Astronomicon are consumed by the Emperor's psychic might. Others were executed point-blank by their attendant chaplains when the telltale signs of demonic corruption appeared upon their bodies. Tigurius himself withered and burned under the strain, but did not falter. He collapsed at the end, his mortal form aged by decades, but only after Calgar's relief fleet had made translation into real space and established an orbit around Vigilus. The Ultramarines' armada had not reached Vigilus without suffering heavy casualties. Several battle barges and strike cruisers, each with a storied history of its own, had fallen in battle en route or had been swallowed by the roiling tides of a warp vortex. The admirals, commodores, and captains of the remaining ships gritted their teeth, squared their jaws, and kept going. When the armada finally neared the Vigilus system, Calgar dispatched Vanguard strike forces to the system's other besieged planets, while his main force pressed on through the remnants of the Orc flotilla to Vigilus itself. Calgar issued communiques to the Space Marines already on the planet below, though he did not inform the planetary governor of his approach. There was no time for formality, and he did not wish to become embroiled in protocol and politicking. He had but one thing on his mind: swiftly and efficiently restoring order to Vigilus. The skies blazed as the Space Marines launched their planet strike, tight formations of drop pods hurtling down to the critical locations Calgar had outlined. In every false continent, the Adeptus Astartes united their efforts with the local forces, restoring hope with their sheer presence, and beginning the long work of stitching the tattered patchwork of Vigilus's defences into a coherent whole. The Lord Macragge himself made straight for the tallest and grandest building of Saints Haven, for he knew the planetary governor would be there in state. While his battle brothers fortified the palace, at times having to pacify its defenders, Calgar made haste to the chambers of the Aquilarian Council. When Calgar flung open the doors to the sumptuous, richly appointed debating hall of the Council of Cogs and demanded an explanation for the war effort thus far, he found evidence not of glory, but of rot and corruption. Ostensibly, the council was a collection of Vigilus's finest, the great and the good, but all Calgar saw was a room full of feckless incompetence. As soon as the initial shock of such an imperial luminary arriving in the flesh wore off, the council devolved into backbiting, sniping, and blame-singing. Pointing a finger of accusation at the members of the council he believed to be traitors to the war effort, Calgar bade his shield brothers round up and remove those he found wanting. One of these malcontents, roughly seized, was exposed to have purplish, knobbly skin under his collar, well concealed by grease paint, but stark when revealed. Another cultist was uncovered soon after, coming to the aid of his fellow with a knife drawn from the flesh of his forearm. It was then that the council hall erupted into a cacophony. The resultant explosion of violence was swift, terminal, and definite. Bolters boomed, Space Marine blades flashed red. Cultists were executed. Council members were bound in chains and exiled. And within the hour, a new form of governance was declared. At the head of this new order was Calgar himself, grim but purposeful. He had suspected that the Genestealer cult uprising might have reached the highest echelons of society, and he had no intention of allowing such a thing to ever happen again. His fellow Adeptus Astartes commanders took their places with a collection of hand-picked advisors from what remained of the Aquilarian Council. The corruption of Saints Haven had finally been excised, and a new body of governance, the Vigilus Senate, installed in its place. The insight of a mastermind. Mynheer Calgar was well known as a strategic genius, a true successor to the Primarch Reboot Galliman. Guided by the advice of his mentor, Ortan Cassius, the chapter master defended the Empire of Ultramar from countless foes. It was Calgar's strategic acumen that broke High Fleet Behemoth as it ventured hungrily across the eastern fringe, defended the Imperium against heretic Astartes, and devastated Necrons of Damnos. Much of this he achieved in close collaboration with his old friend, Varro Tigurius. In recent years, Calgar had found his chief librarian to be distant, haunted even, prone to staring into nothingness for minutes at a time unless spoken to directly. Some said he had glimpsed the true vastness of the void beyond the known limits of the galaxy. Others maintained in psychically dueling the synapse creatures of the Tyranid race, and even prying into the minds of their fallen. He had touched something that had left an indelible mark on his soul. Perhaps it was that latter connection that had alerted Tigurius to the swarming dangers of the Genestealer cult, boiling up from beneath Vigilus's crust. Perhaps it was his greater perspective of the shape of the galaxy, and his fate should he fail, that gave him the insight he imparted to his chapter master. The chief librarian did not say, and never would. The tendrils run deep. The cult of the Pauper Princes, having spread their influence throughout Vigilus for generations, had inveigled themselves into the water processing industry of Otek Hivesprawl. So well hidden were they, so deeply embedded, that only the Space Wolves had senses sharp enough to hunt them down. The Space Wolves, under the Primaris battle leader Haldor Icepelt, were among the first wave of Adeptus Astartes to answer Vigilus's distress calls, making landfall only a few months after the Ironhands and their successors. Upon reaching the planet, the Fenrisians swiftly observed the scarcity of water made it a critical resource, and any who wished to conquer the planet would attempt to gain a monopoly upon it. They sent word to the Aquilarian Council that the Black Mains were inbound, and then made haste to the great reservoirs of Otek Highstraw, known as the Hollows. There they set about rooting out the insidious foes beneath the streets, determined not to let the planet's water supply fall into enemy hands. During the fierce early battles against the uprising in the streets, waged alongside the 14th Vigilant Morning Stars artillery regiment, the Space Wolves believed they had found their true quarry lurking beneath the cityscape around Gragan Hollow. The Morning Stars shelled the whole region, which had been deemed infested beyond recovery, but the Space Wolves charged in. In return, the cult triggered demolition charges that toppled buildings on their foes and then sent out waves of hulking mutated assailants. Close behind came skittering gene stealers to tear apart those who dared to trespass on the cult's domain. The Space Wolves were trapped, and many of their number were slain, but they were not yet defeated. Fighting their way through the alien hordes with blade, tooth and fist, Haldor Icepelt's hunters ventured deep underneath Gragan Hollow, even as the city above seethed in open war. Expert trackers, their senses were so preternaturally sharp, they could detect the scent of the Xenos leaders amongst the subterranean reek of mold, wet rock, stale urine, hypochlorine, and rotten animal carcasses. The oddly mingled scents implied a riot of out-of-control biologies. They were tracking the claw of the thirsting worm, a splinter faction that boasted some of the most disturbing life forms on the planet. Using Fenrisian fieldcraft, the Space Wolves tracked the hybrids through a dank labyrinth of pipes and passageways that would have confounded even other Space Marines. They had to negotiate many traps and false trails in the undertunnels of Gragan Hollows, and fight their way past countless broods and neophyte assailants. Their ferocity and firepower saw them through even when the bullets were flying thick. In the depths of the infestation's heartlands, they were attacked by the Gene Sect's icon-bearer, Gilgas Vendela, and his swollen abominant war leader, Breg. But even they could not stop the Space Wolves' headlong assault. The Gene Stealer cult excelled at ambush, and they knew every inch of their home territory. They had spread far beneath the hive sprawl, using subterfuge and disguise, working out of sight and out of mind to ensure their lairs were as defensible as possible. As Haldor and his kinband progressed, they found themselves hard-pressed once more, gradually worn down by traps, deadfalls, and ambushes. A long, grueling hunt with a fierce battle at its conclusion is a way of life upon Fenris, and the thirsting worms soon found to their cost that the sons of Rust do not tire easily. As he fought through the main purification plant of Gragan Hollow, Haldor detoured to unite with a towering Redemptor dreadnought, Asgard the Frozen. The war machine's piston-driven strength let him smash a path through rock-crate walls and wrench foot-thick pipes aside wherever the strike force's path was barred. Learning of a vast amount of rigged explosives planted in caches throughout the city above, Haldor resolved to turn this would-be booby trap to his advantage. He sent word over the company Vox to his Blackmane brothers in the wider war zone, telling them to sniff out any caches of explosives they could find, and primed them to detonate at a set time. His plan was to trigger a simultaneous detonation above the main macro duct and collapse a vast chunk of the city into the substrata below. He calculated that this would stop the flow of polluted water through the underground pipes to the other high sprawls. Even if Otek could not be saved, there was some hope for the other metropolis's survival. A new pollution. The cultists of the Thirsting Worm had spread throughout the Otek reservoir's infrastructure, and had been spiking the waters with chemicals and foul elixirs. Some of these were brewed from their own blood, solutions that rendered the populace much more susceptible to the hypnosis and mental suggestions of their masters, while others were corrupted by the corpses of those who had died in the cult's service. Successive generations polluted the water still further, until it had a faint purplish hue at times, or a wan yellow at others. Then at the beginning of the uprising in 1.823 post, Hundreds of pipeworker teams and filtration crews had revealed themselves as mutant cultists. Those traitors had swiftly seized the artillery and emplacements on flak batteries around each reservoir, killing those still loyal to the Emperor before taking over the water purification plants one by one. For all their cunning, however, they met their match in the space wolves of Ragnar Blackmane's great company. The cult boiled from the shadows in ever greater numbers, and still the space wolves refused to give up. In the ensuing battles, the cult troops were cut apart by power axe, piston-driven claw, and hypersteel knife, or else blasted to steaming cadavers by tight volleys of mass-reactive shells. Under the direction of Gilgas Vendela, the thirsting worm fell back in a series of deliberate retreats to lure the space wolves into a killing field where the long-hidden explosives could be brought to bear. But in doing so, they conceded the ground that Haldor sought to demolish. It was Haldor himself that set off the last in a circular chain of demolition caches that ringed the city in fire, shaking that district of the metropolis to its core. A half-mile-wide section of Gregan Hollow collapsed into the upper levels below. The remnants of the district were reclaimed by Imperial troops soon afterwards. That saga-worthy deed was not in vain, for it stopped much of the corruption in Vigilus's veins from flowing any further. A subsequent cleanse and purge operation launched by the Death Watch deemed the water too polluted to recover. 2 of the 5 hollows, Gregan and Agamemnus, were pronounced condemnatus, and the others were put under vigil extremis. The planet's resources were in dire peril. Blood Vendetta. The Elder Eye of Craftworld Saim-Hann had divined that Vigilus was of paramount importance in the battle against the great enemy. During the first phase of the War of Beasts, they sent some of their fiercest clan warriors to tip the scales of fate against the chaos uprising that was gathering pace on the planet. The Seer Councillor Saim-Hann, at the instance of Farseer Anvil Keltok, petitioned the clan chiefs to head through the webway towards Vigilus. The Elder Eye were hard-pressed defending their own territory from chaos incursions, but nonetheless sent a small force into the labyrinthine dimension, for they knew their Farseer would not send them on such an errand unless it would further the Craftworld's own agenda. At the head of the webway force was the Autarch Railur of Clan Moerek. Alongside him was his close relative, the Spirit Seer Quelinaris. Farseer Keltok had determined that the critical point of Vigilus's fate could be shifted by the assassination of a single individual, Vanadan the Firebrand. Originally of Storval stock, this demagogue had roused the populace of that volcanic region, converting them to the worship of a fiery god that he alone knew as Sinj, the Changer of Ways. With the seeds of rebellion sown in the fertile ground of Stormval, he had moved on the poorer districts of Hyperia, seeking to convert the people there to his chaotic creed. Should he be allowed to succeed, Keltok had foreseen that an industrial magma eruption would be triggered in Storval, causing a chain reaction that would stretch to the Martyr's Pyre district of Saints Haven. This would kill many of the continent's leaders and destroy the planet's war council. The Elder Eye force emerged from the webway gate in the west of Calyx Bane. The spirit divinations of Kelinaris enabled them to avoid the Drukhari that raided from the blizzards. Making haste upon sleek jet bikes or riding within Way Serpent transports, the Elder Eye sped through the clouds towards their target. They found Vanadan preaching his rhetoric exactly where Keltok had said he would be. Eschewing coordination with Imperial forces, their killing strike was swift. After a brief and bloody battle, Vanadan's lacerated body was pitched into the street. The flashing blurs of Saim-Hann's jet bikes had not gone unnoticed, and the Elder Eye's sudden appearance in Hyperia had been reported to the Aquilarian Council. The planet's rulers, upon hearing that a force of Elder Eye was engaged in the slaughter of citizens, assumed them to be the same breed as the Drukhari that had been reported raiding Otek and Dirkden high schools. The council sent orders for a retribution strike, and within minutes an airborne team of Militarum Tempestus descended from the skies. Dropping into the fray on graveshoots, the 47th Antrail Lions surrounded the Elder Eye even as the Xenos killed the last of Vanadan's tainted rebels. Calgar attempted a parley, explaining that they had excised a canker at the heart of the realm. His words were met with a barrage of firepower. Autarch Railur was gunned down, and most of the Windriders of his kin band were slain alongside him in that first bloody act. Calgar and the surviving withdrew, vowing a bloody revenge. Calgar made haste for the Webway Gate, taking the spirit stones of his slain comrades with him. Upon returning to Saim-Hann, he used all his arts as a spirit seer to install the souls of his kindred in wraithbone shells. He sought not the sanction of the Seer Council, and did not heed the warnings of the other clans. He and his kindred would have their vengeance, even if it meant raising the dead to do so. Years later, when Calgar returned to Vigilus in the third phase of the war, he sought revenge not only against the thuggish infantry that had gunned down his people, but the commanders that had orchestrated the strike. He did not know that by this point the Aquilarian Council had been replaced. Moving fast, the strike force of the living and the dead brought their vendetta against the seat of governance itself, the Aquilarian Palace. There he was to meet his match against the Ultramarines of Marneus Calgar. A tragic mistake. Lieutenant Eothras of the Ultramarine 2nd Company had been entrusted with the defence of the Aquilarian Palace. When he and his Extremist Guard moved to intercept the Eldrai that had slaughtered the Antrail Lions at the eastern gates, he became embroiled in a battle of distractions, feints and false flights. Whilst the bulk of his forces took on the jet bikes that moved like lightning through the plazas and great houses of the palace, he moved to cut off any thrust aimed for the palace's most vital chambers. It was an insightful move, and sure enough, Eothras found Calgar making for the Senate Hall. Eothras approached with the intention of forming a truce, perhaps even an alliance. He had heard from Haldor Icebelt, who had fought alongside the red-armoured Eldrai in the Stygius war zone, that the warrior codes of Saim-Hann were honourable. That day, however, Calgar's code was one of revenge. A bitter struggle broke out, Eldrai slain by plasma and bolt, even as the Primaris Marines were torn apart by wraith cannon fire. The Saim-Hann warband pushed through the Ultramarines' cordon, pinning them with a storm of shuriken and blasting at the doors of the Senate Hall. They were within striking distance of their goal when the doors opened of their own accord, and a quartet of chapter masters stormed out, their honour guard close behind. Calgar was forced to flee for his life, robbed of his final revenge. The Vigilus Senate. One of Calgar's first acts as the new ruler of Vigilus was to reorder its command structure. This decision was not taken lightly, but with undeniable evidence of the gene-stealer cult that infested the planet having reached its highest echelons, the act was clearly necessary. The doors of the Senate Hall were locked, and those dignitaries Calgar had allowed to remain were ordered to tell all they knew of the war effort upon Vigilus thus far. With a united front, the first step on their road to eventual victory was knowledge and communication. The members of the Vigilus Senate found it easy to speak openly in the presence of the Lord Macragge, and progress was swiftly made. The reorganization of the Imperial war machine was by no means confined to its commanders. In order to keep the new Senate focused on the wider war, Calgar gathered an elite band of Ultramarines chosen from across the battle companies at his disposal, their duty to bar the path of any who would try for a decapitating strike upon Imperial High Command. This force Calgar called the Extremist Guard, led by Lieutenant Eothras, a rising hero who had proven himself in the long baleful wars against Mortarian's Death Guard. Eothras was one of the finest minds in the 2nd Company, and had a statesman's wisdom that echoed that of the Primarch himself. The appointment proved wise. Within days of the Extremist Guard's formation, they engaged, stalled, and ultimately saw off an Eldrai attack that could have crippled the entire Vigilus command structure. End quote. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. Then please do consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications bell button, as I would not want you to miss out. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make time for fun. Toodaloo.